This is the remaining history of the story of Kerwin Heights. Like most of western Pennsylvania, prior to 1900s development and the Industrial Revolution, the 1800s, you had Fort Pitt, the city of Pittsburgh, it was still developed. But Fort Pitt and Fort Duquesne at the Three Rivers, the history really of this area goes back to the 1700s and the French and Indian War prior to the Declaration of Independence in the 1790s. The early 1700s, most of western Pennsylvania was still inhabited by Seneca and lots of Indians that I can't remember the names of, the Monongahela peoples, the Rivers people, up until the French actually built Fort Duquesne here and settled the Three Rivers that would later be burned down and taken by the British, become Fort Pitt, and establishment of Fort Pitt. The history of Pittsburgh. But during the Whiskey Rebellion in the 1790s, this little area here of Kerwin Heights, before it was ever Kerwin Heights in the early 1900s, General John Neville had a house here, and there was an old church, an old stone church in the 1700s known as Old St. Luke's Church. And shortly after the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution in the 1790s, this is part of our history, there was something known as the Whiskey Rebellion. And George Washington and the Union sent troops down here to suppress it. And he sent troops down here to General John Neville's house. General John Neville had a house here, and General George Washington was known to come here and stay here in this area. And legend or the ghost of General John Neville is said to haunt that place, and the ghost of George Washington be seen with him riding an old canoe. They would take their old canoes down Chartiers Creek, all the way down through McKee's Rocks, down and then paddle up the Ohio River, stop and camp out at Neville Island on the Ohio River, and then continue their canoe journey all the way up the river to the point, Fort Pitt at the time, or the city of Pittsburgh today. And that's the legend of their old historic journey of General George Washington and General John Neville from the Neville House. Chartiers Creek flows right up to Fort Pitt, and they would get horses or trade for supplies at the pit, and take the horses back up and drag the canoes back up. So that's the legend and story of how General John Neville and George Washington would travel to Fort Pitt for supplies. And in those times, in the 1790s, there was something known as the Whiskey Rebellion, and General John Neville's house, as well as Old St. Luke's Church, was the site of it, where it happened. People were pissed off about paying increased taxes, so George Washington went and shut that shit down. So imagine that, fighting an American Revolution only to have another. There were lots of little rebellions. It was a small rebellion, really, but it was part of the history. And General John Neville's house and the history of Fort Pitt was definitely part of the early history of what would later become known as Kerwin Heights in the early 1900s or the 20th century. So John Nighthawk signing off with part 2 to the history of Kerwin Heights. Go watch part 1 for a more recent history of Kerwin Heights. The more recent history of Kerwin Heights begins with the development of Mr. C.P. Casper P. Mayer developing what they would call Mayer Street, and down by the creek that borders Bridgeville for those lands, the development of mills like vanadium mills and train lines and general stores and stuff. There was a brickyard down there. The whole Kerwin Heights Industrial Park was developed by Mr. Mayer. Around 1903 to 1919, they began building it, and the train lines and the coal rail yards really took off. And Mr. Mayer had 3 main levels in Kerwin Heights: the old train line and the mill. Then the houses were built for all the mill workers, were the Kerwin Heights namesake of the Kerrs and the Winstein families, is why they're named Kerwin Heights. And above was Mayer Airfield, an old airstrip and an old farm that was known as Mayer Airfield in 1919 up until about the 1950s. So this is part 2 to the history of Kerwin Heights, and there's lots of it, but the name Kerwin Heights comes from the Kerrs and Winstein families, some of the first families to start building houses here. And Kerwin Heights sits on the train line in Washington Pike between Bridgeville and Carnegie. In the early 1900s, people would take trains back and forth. So that's part 2 to the history of Kerwin Heights.